This is Dennis Ramundi. I'm here with my co-host, Phil Goldberg, author of American Veda. Our podcast, Spirit Matters, found at spiritmatterstalk.com. Our guest today, back on the show, Marianne Williamson, best-selling New York Times author, spiritual teacher, inspirational lecturer, and somebody who is known worldwide. Her focus right now is on a conference she has coming up this coming February called Sister Giant. It's going to be held in Washington, D.C., and we'll get all of those details from Marianne today. And we are here to discuss and promote that conference. Marianne, thank you so very much for taking the time to come on our show today.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Marianne, let's get right to it. We're recording this right before Christmas 2016. And for the last month or so or more, the intersection of spirituality and politics and social action has been on a lot of people's minds. You have Sister Giant coming up in less than 2 months. Tell us what inspired it and what the audience should know about it.
Well, I'm one of those who believes that one of the reasons that the Democrats have been losing so pointedly, not only on a presidential level, but also on a congressional level, is because the soul of the Democratic Party has been sucked out of it. Bobby Kennedy talked about how this was a contest for the soul of our nation. And the left-wing progressive conversation in the United States has become so over-secularized. It's so transactional rather than transformational. People talk about alliances and coalition building, but as the I Ching says, even thieves have alliances. There's some deeper level that we need to speak to each other from. Gandhi said politics should be sacred. By that, he didn't mean religious in any kind of dogmatic or doctrinal sense. He meant that politics should be, once again, as he said, a part of Dharma too. It should be that which is an expression of our deeper, authentic self. And if you look at the actual gold at the center, the mystical golden core of the American ideal, it is not just radical politically, it's radical spiritually. It has to do with the idea, it is the idea that we could develop a society where, to the best of our ability, people are capable of self-actualization, that there would not be chains that bind them, that there would not be things holding them back from the fullest expression of themselves. That's the American ideal. It's not just what you as a gay person can get, or you as a black person can get, or you as a Muslim can get, or Jews can get, as a woman can get. It's what all of us can have because we are within this context of America. And I think that I think people are hardwired for love of country. We're hardwired for love of God. And if you don't give us the real thing, people will take the ersatz version. And that's what's happened. The right wing has co-opted the genuinely patriotic love of nation, the genuine, and replaced it with the ersatz. It's done the same thing with any spiritual or sense of higher power concept. So I think that the reclamation of the deeper spiritual and emotional and philosophical and psychological dimensions of progressive politics and of America itself is not only essential in order to reclaim progressive politics, but far more importantly, is essential in order to resist the demagoguery and the ideological poison that is now perched to dominate over the next 4 years. Mm-hmm. So many people that I know, and I myself, when someone like Gandhi or King talk about nonviolent resistance. So how do we practice nonviolence? How do we practice a higher spiritual love, let's say, for someone like a Donald Trump, and at the same time passionately and effectively resist what many of us see as a real fascist agenda that is in the air today?
Okay. Marianne, back in April, I helped organize a talk that you gave out here in Iowa to support Senator Bernie Sanders in his bid to get the Democratic nomination to run for president. Got a big crowd. You were very inspiring. Do you think that his message, which obviously connected with a lot of people, was a message of that was not transactional but was transformative? And one of the reasons he inspired so many people was that he was connecting with people on a spiritual level.
Absolutely, I do. And I think that the way the elite Democratic machinery establishment suppressed his candidacy was because the transactional corporatists weren't going to have they weren't going to have it. And how well did that work out? I said at the talk that you're mentioning, I remember saying, I saw it on YouTube the other day, that this was not an establishment moment. The American people have figured out that the economy is completely unjust. It's completely skewered in favor of the top 1%, and that there was going to be a populist revolution. The only choice we had was between a progressive populism or an authoritarian populism. And I think the Bernie Sanders supporters were providing the Democratic Party with the winning alternative, which was the progressive populism, in the absence of which people, once again, you don't give people the real thing, they go for the ersatz version. And that's a total example. The Bernie Sanders campaign offered genuine populism, and when it wasn't, when the Democratic Party would not contain that, would not provide a platform for that, people went for the ersatz version. God help us.
Marianne, the logo that I see on my screen for Sister Giant says, "Those who sit should also take a stand." I think that's brilliant, actually, and it's very much very close to something I wrote recently. Expand on that, if you would, because there's a lot of people in the spiritual world whose reaction to the election was, everything. Change comes from sitting, and we can all meditate and pray, and things will, if we think right, turn out right.
Well, I think there are a lot of people who say that, but I think there are a lot more who are not saying that. Every movement, just like every person, has a shadow side, but the shadow is not who they are. There's nothing holy about complacency, obviously. That sort of silliness and ditziness and all disengagement with a kind of ersatz, artificial spiritual cover, it's there, but I don't think it is what this movement stands for. In fact, if you look at the history of social justice movements in the United States, you're starting with abolition, which emerged from the Quakers. Many of the leaders of the women's suffragette movement were Quakers, and obviously Dr. Martin Luther King was a Baptist preacher. When you look at the most powerful social justice movements in the United States, they came from a spiritual vortex, because the spiritual foundation gives you two profound powers. Number one, conviction. Conviction that whatever is right now is absolutely intolerable, and number two, what is possible is capable of being evoked through what Martin Luther King would call a higher level of companionship. If you cosmic companionship, he said. If you take something like slavery, there were many people who were against slavery. The difference between those who were against slavery and those who actually became abolitionists were those who felt that it was a moral imperative, not just to criticize it, but to take a stand against it. That spiritual power gives you that this is not to be tolerated, not on our watch. But also, when you have a faith-based perspective, you also believe that anything is possible through the grace of God. And we need that right now. We need people who are willing not only to take a stand against a neo-fascist agenda, white supremacist and so forth, but we need people who are capable, because they understand the concept of summoning the alternative out of the ethers. Because within the three-dimensional plane, Donald Trump has a lot sewn up. He's won the presidency, he's got the Senate, he's got the House, and he's also got millions of people who are enrolled in what many of us perceive as a diabolical vision. 1/3 of his Twitter supporters are also belong to white supremacist Twitter sites. So we need to use the power of the mind and of the spirit to invoke that which literally intercedes and breaks through the chains that are represented by merely three-dimensional powers to a dimension of possibility which is spiritual in nature.
Marianne, you mentioned moral imperatives. What do you believe to be the moral imperatives of our time that we need to embrace?
The moral imperative of our time, if it had been before this election, I said the moral imperative of our generation was to get the money out of politics, because the money, the undue influence of money on our politics is the cancer underlying all the cancers. Given what that's already done, by the way, and that fact was deeply influential on the de-juicing of the Democratic Party, because it was when the Democrats started taking the corporate Wall Street donations and all of that, that's when the de-juicing of the Democratic Party began. Right now, the moral imperative is to take a stand against encroaching fascism.
Well, they seem to have taken the money out of politics by putting it right in the cabinet.
It's unbelievable. This cabinet is filled with billionaires and generals. It's this velvet militarism. That's another very, very dangerous, not just the billionaires, but also this image that's being provided, particularly for our kids, to let the generals handle this. What could be worse for America? And what could be more un-American, by the way?
Right. I mean, I want to mention that there was that, I don't know if it was a written law or something that was always followed, that if somebody was going to be Secretary of Defense, they had to be out of the military at least 7 years. The gentleman that was selected has been out only 3 years, so Congress needs to approve that. But again, I think that if you give a vision of chaos, and I'm going to bring order to that chaos, then that's when the generals come in, and that's when fascism and
absolutely,
that makes it all very possible. I wanted to ask Marianne also. You mentioned you wrote that these are painful times, but they are also pregnant with new possibilities. What is the hope? What are the possibilities that are out there now?
Well, I would think that you guys would agree with me that despite everything, there's an awakening in the air today. A lot of people that have been disengaged. I mean, Americans sometimes remain asleep for a very long time. But when we awaken, we slam it like nobody's business. There's a reason why Churchill was famous for saying that you can always count on Americans to do the right thing after they have exhausted every other option. And I think that there's an awakening now, and that's why we're doing Sister Giant, because I think a lot of people are like, oh, okay, I get there's a problem. What do I do?
Right.
And that's why we're doing the conference, and that's also why we're doing it right after the inauguration. We're not waiting. We can't afford to wait. People say, well, if you do it in March, you'll have more time to prepare. This is an urgent time in American history. It's like people who say, well, let's wait and see. Wait and see. He's already appointed this cabinet filled with billionaires and generals. He said he was going to drain the swamp, and he's just poured more alligators in there than ever were before.
Marianne, you also have on the Sister Giant site the question posed, what are the deeper transformational lessons to be learned from this moment?
Yes. I think one of the transformational lessons to be learned is this is what happens when you don't tend to your democracy generation after generation. This is what happens when when too many of the best and the brightest in your country disengage. This is what happens when you're not watchful. This is what happens when you let one undemocratic transgression occur, and then you let another one occur, and then you let another one occur. It's like, what did you expect to happen? You have to put gas in your car. You have to tend to your car. You have to tend to your to your relationship if you really want to have one. What made us think you didn't have to tend to your democracy? And what kind of naivete led us to think that if we weren't tending to it, that the most regressive forces wouldn't take advantage of that opening? And another transformational lesson is that, as the French would say, you don't do politics, politics do you. The problem with disengaging from politics is that the people you would least want to have lead you will do that. Now, those are part of all one transformational matrix, but I think they're all important, and I think we need to ask ourselves very deeply, what do I feel about racism? It's easy for people to say, oh, I'm not a racist. I certainly don't want a racist society. On the other hand, what have you done to speak out about the private prison system, the prison industrial complex, the fact that 1 in 3 African-American men statistically will end up in jail? What have you done? How deeply have you entered into the yes, obviously inconvenient and uncomfortable conversation regarding the racial disparity in our criminal justice system. These are the transformational lessons. The lesson is you live a superficial life, you're going to have problems. You're going to be superficial with your relationship's not going to work out. You're going to be superficial with your career's not going to work out. And you're going to be superficial with your country and with your democracy, those aren't going to work out either.
Right. You mentioned the prison system, and and it really being a great sin, I think, of our society. 13% of the population is African American. 43% of the people incarcerated are African American, usually serving longer terms. I think President Obama was just beginning to address that. And by the way, these prisoners are in jail at an average of $83,000 a year per prisoner. So it's a great drain on the society, and it's corrupt and wrong. I think many people feel in every way. The other area that I'd like you to touch upon, and I know you'll be covering it in your conference, is the environment. We may be one of the only country out of 200 that is not embracing the concept of global warming, and God knows if we're going to do anything about it now. Your thoughts on that, Marianne?
Well, it's part of the horror of this present moment. The new head of the EPA, appointed by President-elect Trump, as we all know, Mr. Pruitt, is a climate change denier. He has frequently tried to sue the EPA. He's one of several new cabinet secretary appointees whose desire is to basically dismantle the agency that he has been appointed to head. So it's horrifying. President-elect Trump has said that he thinks we should not be part of the Paris climate change agreement. But it's an interesting thing. There's something so dark here. On one hand, he speaks to Al Gore. Al Gore comes out of the meeting saying it was extremely interesting, saying it was to be continued, and obviously sincerely believing that. The very next day, Trump appoints Pruitt as head of the EPA. So this is his modus operandi. He leads us to have some hope, and he slaps you, and then he soothes you and calms you. Something really dark going on over here, and he tries to cover it up by something light going on over there. Some people would say I'm being too cynical here, but I'm simply being descriptive. This is simply what's happening.
Marianne, I want to ask you something that has come up in my conversations with people. You are plainly upfront with your progressive politics. The Sister Giant Conference is it even says are bringing together an illuminating mix of progressive voices. Not everybody who has a sincere spiritual life and is even a spiritual teacher, a spiritual leader, is progressive politically. There are people who are libertarian or conservative. What do you say in your conversations with them, and how do you bring them in to the larger picture without alienating?
Well, it's certainly not my fault that the extreme right wing has taken over the Republican Party. I agree with President Eisenhower, who said that the American mind at its best is both liberal and conservative. So I grew up at a time, for instance, where there wasn't this sense that Republicans stood for something terrible. It was understood we all had the same goal, and they emphasized issues of private morality. They emphasized issues of the benefits of the market and a market-driven economy, all of which has a place. And then the liberals were more focused on issues of public morality and the idea of our collective responsibility to the common good. The dance between those two is important. But right now, as we know, too many of the high-minded conservative voices are themselves out of power. Mm-hmm. I mean, look what Trump did to Romney. He's another example. Like the meeting with Al Gore. So high-minded conservative values I have respect for. And I learn from, and you don't just learn from people who agree with you. And because I do have such strong views, I'm someone who totally needs to be kept on track sometimes, and I do hear conservatives who say, who say things and go, well, they're right, that's correct as well. However, today, that is not that high-minded conservatism is not in charge of the Republican Party. So right now, to be honest, I don't want to give a platform for anything that would take us away from what I believe has to be an intense focus on winning the House of Representatives back in 2018. And that does not mean voting Republican.
Marianne, you've been
And
criticized.
wait, hold on. I
Go
want to
ahead.
ask you a question.
No.
Is that a reasonable answer?
It sounds reasonable to me, and I will imitate it when I'm confronted with it.
Yeah, and I respect people like Anna Navarro, for instance. I mean, there are a lot of or David Frum.
Right.
There are a lot of principled conservatives who are standing up to the Trump agenda, and I respect them for that.
Yes.
It's just that that's their job right now. Mine is mine.
Right.
Do you know what I'm saying?
Yes, indeed.
Yeah.
William Crystal just resigned from the Daily Standard, and a strong conservative, but cannot handle
Who did?
Trump.
I'm sorry.
William Crystal.
Huh.
He did.
Yeah, and
Wow.
he so somebody new took over, somebody who I think is going to play ball with Trump more than William Crystal would, and George Will still is very outspoken. So yeah, there are a lot of conservatives. Jim Leach was a congressman from Iowa, and actually conservative in many ways, but he spoke out against the Iraq War both times, and has been very marginalized by the Republican Party. He's teaching in a law school now. So those voices are there, and I think they should be listened to. I want to get back to Marianne. You've known worldwide as a spiritual teacher, and I'm sure you've been criticized for getting involved in politics. I know, Phil, you're known for spirituality, and people. What are you talking about politics for? Why do you bring it on your podcast? The people I know that associate me with politics say, "Why are you involved in spirituality?" The people that know me that are involved in spirituality say, "Stick to politics." So again, and you've talked about this, Marianne, but if you could talk about it again, because it's such an important point. Why is it okay, and not only okay, but appropriate for deeply spiritual people who are committed to spirituality to also have an agenda in the world to be political?
Because we're Americans. Because we live on this earth. We also take a shower. We also eat. We also drive cars. I mean, this idea that is that not being part of the world? Taking care of your body, eating food, taking care of your family, having a job, going to work. It's ridiculous. Politics is, as Eisenhower said, politics should be a part-time profession of every American.
Right.
And I think it's part of, spirituality is not about ignoring the world. It's about transforming the world.
Right.
And how do you transform the world with love if you refuse to disengage with it?
Mm-hmm.
I said to someone recently who told me that, I said, well, if your son or daughter suddenly had a school principal who was doing terrible and fascistic things, wouldn't you respond? And, this is not very different from that. But
I do. I think, I must say, I think most of the disengagement, and I know this sounds a little harsh, but I think most of the disengagement on the part of so-called spiritual types, disengagement from the political process, and this is not true of everyone, but I think most of it that I hear is not from a deeply principled place. It's from a place where people are in denial, perhaps even to themselves, about how they're just looking for an excuse for not helping. Mm-hmm. And a kind of half-baked spiritual understanding is used as a cover. There is, in fact, no serious spiritual path, no serious religious path that gives any of us a pass on addressing the suffering of other sentient beings. Mm-hmm. The idea of a spirituality that doesn't care about genocide, that doesn't care about atrocities, that says, oh, it's all an illusion anyway. So would they be, if they were walking down the street and somebody falls down in front of them with a heart attack, does that mean that in the name of spirituality, they would not call 911?
Mm-hmm. No, I think that very, very well put. And as a matter of fact, when I'm confronted with people that try to disengage spirituality from politics, and I think one of the dangers of spiritual practices, one can become self-absorbed, is I said, well, I do know people that are deeply spiritual, that are very concerned about what's going on in the world, and even political, like Marianne Williamson or Pope Francis or the Dalai Lama. very deeply committed to changing the world, and that depth of commitment comes from their own inner spirituality. And I think it's just, and Phil and I, right, we've experienced so many folks that have we come to who, because of their spiritual backgrounds, but it seems at some point, especially as they grow in their spirituality, they feel committed to making social change.
Yeah, and those are the very people, the very kinds of people that Marianne has coming to Sister Giant. To get back to that, I see people on your speaker list, Marianne, like Andrew Harvey, who's a friend and who we've had on the show. You have Mary Morrissey, Robert Thurman, Gene Houston, and other people better known in the political arena. Please tell us more about what's going to take place on February 2nd to the 4th.
Well, it's Thursday night, all day Friday, and all day Saturday. So the idea here is that, as Gandhi said, the end is inherent in the means. Everything we do is infused with the consciousness with which we do it. So if we set about seeking to resist the Trump agenda only from a place of rage, anger, cynicism, and so forth, then we will not succeed, because when you have a black magician, which is basically what we're talking about here, Michelle Obama received the word of God when she said, "They go low, we go high." Instead, what Hillary Clinton did was she wandered into the black magician's cave, and he will eat you for lunch every time. The only choice is to go high. So we go high by decluttering our own consciousness of our own anger. We're just saying it like it is. It's simply that this is not acceptable. This is not about personal anger at Donald Trump. It is about an absolute unwillingness to abide by an agenda that we find intolerable, undemocratic, and un-American. So the first day, when you mention people like Andrew Harvey and Gene Houston, what we will do on Friday is we will talk about the archetypal realities, the spiritual realities. When I look at something like misogyny, anti-Semitism, racism, xenophobia, they're like herpes. Once they're in your system, you don't get rid of them, but you hope that they do not become symptomatic. So these forces, they are like ancient strains of darkness within the human psyche, and they will be there apparently until we are completely enlightened as human beings. But they are usually kept from becoming symptomatic in a way that can actually disturb the social order. And that's what happened this time, because these dark strains of psychic strains were harnessed for political purposes. So we need to have a deep conversation, not just how to suppress the symptom of racism or the symptoms of misogyny. We need to have a deep conversation about how to route out of our consciousness the misogyny and the racism themselves. So that's what Friday is about. There's a religion panel. There's a panel talking about what these deeper internal changes are that need to occur. So that by the time we get to Saturday and we're talking about voter suppression and we're talking about criminal injustice and we're talking about the environment and we're talking about getting the money out of politics, we are grounded in a different place of consciousness than we would have been had we not gone through the processes of the day before.
Wonderful.
So
go
on. I'm sorry. No, that's it. That's it. Just we approach the political issues from a genuinely integrated place. We don't just talk about it. We actually go through the internal changes to the best of our ability so that we are prepared for the path ahead, as not just as people coming from a transactional political perspective, but from a genuine transformational field of possibility.
So the conference, Sister Giant 2017, the location, Washington, D.C., February 2nd to 4th. It will also, I understand, Marianne, stream live. Do you want to tell us about that?
Yes. If people go to sistergiant.com, they will see not only how to register to be there in person, and I think if people can get there in person, there's nothing like being in the room where it happens, right? Being in the room where you're with so many like-minded people who are going through those same internal processes. But people can also live stream it. And if you go to sistergiant.com, you'll see all of that.
And we'll have that all posted up on our blog at spiritmatterstalk.com. Thank you so much, Marianne. Any final words, Phil?
I would just ask Marianne, because some people might tune into this after February and after the conference, because it'll be archived. What can you say about post-Sister Giant conference activities that they may be interested in?
Well, it's funny, Dennis, you might not realize this, but you said to me the other day, you wrote me an email, and you referred to the Giant Steps Conference.
Right.
And I thought, I wonder if he's receiving something. To be honest, the Sister Giant conferences, they're kind of like a party that I put on because I want to, and I don't want to start another nonprofit. I don't want to start a C4. I've done all that in my life. And to be honest, I was hoping never to have to do anything like that again. Those are really shark-infested waters, necessary though they are. Mm-hmm. And so I just, for myself, speaking only for myself, my goal is that you leave Sister Giant lit up. And what you do after that is none of my business. And what I do after that, I can't know either. I think if people stay in touch with me at Marianne.com, then you'll hear whatever I've got going. And if I feel moved after Sister Giant to form what Dennis already named Giant Step, then I'm sure I'll be guided to do that. Right now, my guidance is, number one, to produce the conference, and also after this podcast to ask you guys to refer back to something you were talking about earlier on the podcast that I want to ask you about in terms of more conservative voices.
Great.
Thank you so much for being with us, Marianne, and keep up the good work.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm honored.
Thank you. A pleasure, and we look forward to having you on again.